Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the list you've all been waiting for. Well, no, I don't know how many of you have been waiting for it, but we'll see. 10 cult conductors and 2 cult wannabes. Yeah. Oh, this is fun. This is going to be so much fun. Conductors who have pathetic groups of worshipful followers, and some of them deserve it. Some of them don't. Most of them don't. Nobody deserves a cult, frankly, but at least some of them are more artistically worthy than others. And the people who follow them are completely out of their mind and have no lives and need probably psychiatric help. So let's, without further ado, talk about the conductors and the crazies that salivate and drool and palpitate over their every sniglet of musical production. Okay, Arturo Toscanini. You know, the Toscanini cult is not quite as strong as it used to be. It was quite the thing in like the 60s and even the 70s, and when these, the Toscanini editions were coming out on RCA, some of them were creeping out of the woodwork, to scream and yell and carry on. But the truth of the matter is, Toscanini is probably the most deserving because he's simply the most important. He's the greatest of the conductors on this list. And there isn't any question about that historically. I know some people will say, I don't like him, I blah, blah, blah. But again, we're talking about the judgment of history and also the high regard in which he was held by his fellow artistes. And, some people disliked his approach and thought that, and his later recordings, let's face it, they could be somewhat rigid. And sonically, maybe they weren't always the best, but boy, he was some great conductor in a tremendous amount of repertoire. He really was. And his approach to music making, his standards became the standard of 20th century performance. I mean, his Beethoven Seventh with the New York Philharmonic, which he recorded in the 1930s or something like that, sounds like a modern orchestra playing Beethoven Seventh at the top of its game. And that was the standard. And when he took that orchestra on tour with that music and played it in Europe, everybody just went, whoa, we need to raise our game. He was the Tiger Woods of conducting. He was somebody who was just so good and at such a higher level than just about everybody around him that they all began to improve in order to achieve what they knew was possible, but hadn't known was possible until he showed them. And that's why he was a great conductor, and that's why he has a cult following. Now, his cult following, I mean, do you want to hear all 7 performances of this work recorded between the 20s and the 40s and air checks and things, that to me is insanity. I don't think it makes any sense. I don't find it interesting, but some people do. So he has his cult. It's a more benign cult because, Tovey had a very interesting comment about cults. He was talking about the Mahler cult versus the Bruckner cult. And he said that the Mahler cult will be healthier than the Bruckner cult because it discourages a cult of amateurishness, whereas the Bruckner people would take every insecurity and mistake or lack of something and try and position it as a hallmark of quality and as a positive thing. And for Tovey, that was ridiculous. If you want to have a cult of somebody who's really good, because they will raise your game. And that's Toscanini. And that's why his cult is less, harmful than some of the others. Jascha Horenstein. Okay, we've been talking about him quite a bit because he was on my list of most annoying conductors. Some of these people are. And, there was a very, very intelligent comment I got about Jascha Horenstein from a listener who said, yes, he frequently got horrible results, but I find his music making speaks to me, and it has a certain sincerity that I find appealing. He gave the spiel, and I can't argue with that. No matter how bad he was, if he speaks to you and you enjoy listening to him, then that's what you get to do. But But my point was, okay, I grant that. Everybody has a right to like what everybody wants, but there are standards. And we can make the comparisons. And when we do make the comparisons, we find out that he comes up wanting as often as not, which means he wasn't really that good a conductor. And he certainly, to have a cult of people who worship the ground he walks on, oh my goodness, I think that's just such a horrible waste of time. So Jascha Horenstein is definitely one of the not so good cult people. However wonderful he was. And the same holds true, by the way, of our next entrant, John Barbirolli. Barbirolli was a wonderful musician, and he was so sincere and so spontaneous and so inconsistent. Oh my God. And the BBC released all that live stuff, all those Mahler performances. Oh, they were just horrible. The Mahler 2 at Stuttgart, where they all get lost at the end. I mean, he was really, really, his recordings are exceptional because he was in the studio and he could take the time to get it right. And he was able to do that, by the way, in the studio without sacrificing his natural spontaneity and emotionalism and warmth and humanity and all the, nonsense that people claim that he exemplified. And he did. No, he did. It's not nonsense. I mean, that there was something about him that was wonderfully giving and emotionally sincere, unquestionably. But a lot of his work was subpar. Oh, my goodness. And so naturally, there's a cult. And I think there's even a society. Isn't there a Barbirolli society? I don't understand societies. Boy, do I not understand that. Why you would form a group and get together and on a regular basis and just talk about this person regularly, about how wonderful he is, and presumably how wonderful you all are for thinking how wonderful he is. Ugh, gives me a chill. Barbirolli has a cult. He made some great records. He really did. But he was very, very, very on again, off again. He really was. Then there's Oswald Kabasta. Oh, this is an interesting cult. Oswald Kabasta made there's like half a dozen recordings that exist. Not very much. He committed suicide. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi who, after his World War II and his team lost, was a very bad sport. And so he offed himself as well. And he got famous because some people mistook his recording, I think it was of Dvorak's New World Symphony, for a Furtwängler recording. And they were wrong. And rather than admitting that they were wrong, when it turned out that the recording was of a not very interesting, by the way, New World Symphony, it was okay. It wasn't, the bee's knees. Instead of confessing their mistake and just, leaving him be, they decided because he was accidentally misidentified as a Furtwängler that he was as good as a Furtwängler. What? How's that for irrationality? And so Kabasta has people who listen to his half a dozen recordings and think he's just, one of the great losses to world culture. Oh, here's a news flash. He's not. He really isn't. He's a Kabasta. And that's the way it goes. So Kabasta. Then we've got Yevgeny Mravinsky. Now, Mravinsky is a cult conductor because, first of all, he had the Leningrad Philharmonic, which he raised to very, 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 very high level. And we have the recordings to prove it, the Tchaikovsky 4, 5, and 6, and his Shostakovich and some live things that he did. The problem with Mravinsky is that he hated making recordings. And so everything that we have is live. Almost everything that we have is live. Let's put it that way. And it's mostly on melodia, and it's mostly on horrible sound. And so people go running around listening to all of the horrible live recordings that on melodia of the same music to try and find one that has, first of all, the orchestra playing at the top of its form. And that was a relatively brief period where he really had them going well. I mean, in the late 50s, 60s, up until about 1970, 71, 72. After that, they weren't as good as they had been. And that's audible too, because we have the recordings. So we've got, culty people who are pretending that the later stuff isn't very good or that it's still valuable because that has insights. That's what you always say, when everything goes to hell and sounds like crap, you say, well, but it has insights. Well, they can never tell you what the insights are, and they can never distinguish the insights in the later bad recording from the insights in the previous good recording, because we always have previous versions. So Mravinsky also has a cult, and they listen to these air checks and these grati melodia things, and that are just almost intolerable for most of us normal people, and they purport to hear that which mere mortals can only dimly apprehend. Hermann Scherchen. Oh, yeah, Scherchen deserves a cult. Let's just face it, he deserves a cult. Scherchen was nuts. He was nuts, and his cult people are nuts, and they're like your crazy uncle, that everybody loves, but he's nuts. That's Scherchen. He's a lovable nut. He did everything. He did everything from Bach to Schoenberg, and he didn't care what he conducted. He did tons and tons of modern stuff. He'd do anything with any orchestra. His Beethoven followed metronome marking sometimes when he felt like it, was like blisteringly crazy fast, and his Bach was insanely crazy slow, and you never knew what you were going to get. And sometimes it was just fabulous, and sometimes it was just horrible. And it's all just so much fun. It really is. I have total sympathy for the Scherchen cult. I mean, I've got his big boxes, and I understand it. I understand it completely. I really do. If you were here for random reviews in the overflow room, I have all the Japanese Scherchen CDs. I had my Scherchen phase, and it was fun. It was a happy time. And I think listening to him is just one of those joys where whether it's good or bad or indifferent doesn't make any difference. You're just going to have a whale of a good time. And so I get it. I get those cult people. But on the other hand, at some point, you've got to care more about quality of music making than just the fact that this loon was out there just winging it. But he did wing it well. I give him that. Dimitri Mitropoulos has a cult, particularly in Greece, because it's not like they have a lot of choice. You've got Mitropoulos and you've got Maria Callas, and that's about it. And Mikos Theodorakis for Zorba the Greek and the composer world, because Skalkatis was a much better composer, but he did atonal stuff, and so that freaks them out. So you've got Mitropoulos, who was he was a very gifted and interesting, high-tension, neurotic conductor. If you have that Mitropoulos box on Columbia, you see that a lot of what he did was tremendously exciting, but it was also a little bit, catch as catch can. It was a little kind of random. You never quite knew what was happening there. He had this genius memory. He memorized everything that he conducted. He did it all from memory. It was really remarkable. He was an amazing musician. Was he cult worthy? Well, there are great recordings for sure. And he was an early proponent of Mahler. But I encountered the Mitropoulos cult dealing with his Mahler recordings, which are they were released mostly on Tara and some other labels. I have them. We'll get them when we get to Mahler in the overflow room. I have a bunch of them still, I think. And they were really bad. Most of them were really bad. I mean, they were fast and hasty and sloppy, and he did cuts, he did all kinds of strange things. I mean, but he was playing it. He was doing it at a time when few others were. And so he gets credit for that. But does that mean the performances have to be great? Whoa, baby, no, they don't. They really don't. He was a splendid conductor. He really was. But as an object of worship, the point of it all eludes me. It really does. So, but then again, all cults kind of elude me, except for Scherchen. I get Scherchen. But, Mitropoulos is not a cult people. Then we've got Takashi Asahina, the Japanese conductor who did a Bruckner cycle a day. It keeps the Furtwängler cult away. That's how that works. He was a student of Furtwängler, or he was inspired by Furtwängler, or something like that. He was the Japanese Furtwängler. And he had a lot in common. Because, well, no, he didn't actually. Furtwängler was generally a quick, neurotic conductor, and Asahina was kind of slow and sloppy, and he made, all these people made good records. That's not the issue. The issue isn't whether or not they make good records. The issue is, do they deserve to be worshipped? And, because of what they did. Asahina the Japanese were looking for somebody to worship. I mean, he's definitely a second-rate talent. In spite of making 25 Bruckner cycles, none of which go entirely well. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. The playing of the Osaka Philharmonic, which is where he was for a lot of his career, is always, And he did all the German standard stuff. He did Beethoven, he did Schubert, he did what, and most of the time it was lethargic and heavy and ensemble-wise not too tidy. And I know his fans will pick out and say, well, no, but that one's great. No, that one's great. But like I said, I'm not saying he didn't make a couple great records. But the consistency was definitely not there. He had such a reputation as a spiritual icon. And that has nothing to do with music, frankly. Nothing. Zero. Zippo. If you love him for his spirituality, do what you want. He's a deity. He's not a musician. So that's Asahina. And then we've got Sergiu Celibidache. Well, we all talk about him. He's slower than crap. He had strange ideas about micro thingies and tiny whatevers, and he didn't believe in records because records were not music. In response to which, since he died, all they're doing, his family's doing, is exploiting his reputation to the hilt by releasing recordings, most of the time proving that he was right not to make records because most of his records just suck beyond belief. They are slow and soggy, but he had a point of view. You see, he had a concept. And the Germans particularly, oh my God, they love a concept. I know this. They love an ideology. I had a big fight with one of my German professors at Stanford. I remember vividly. His name was Hans Ulrich Wehler. He wrote a book called Bismarck und Imperialismus, which I had to read, auf Deutsch. Oh my God, it was impossible. It was endless. It had sentences that went on for pages with all the verbs at the end. It was like 600 pages long, and for the first 300 pages, he was defining imperialism. He didn't even get to Bismarck. And we had this huge argument about the paper that I'd written. And he said to me, the problem with you American students is that you have no ideology. And I just looked at him and said, and you Germans are such a brilliant and fabulous example of what having an ideology accomplishes, aren't you? And he sort of went off muttering and, and Celibidache was like that. He had his concept, and he talked about his concept and imposed it upon the orchestra. And that concept had absolutely nothing to do, in a positive sense, with 90% of the music that he conducted. When it worked, it could be stunning. But most of the time, it was just a waste. It was ridiculous, but people got the concept. And so he has his cult of conceptual-like thinkers. And they can all go and enjoy their concept and stick it where the sun don't shine. It's just ridiculous. But there you go. That's how you get a cult. And last but not least, the ultimate cult conductor, of course, is Wilhelm Furtwängler. We've talked about this cult endlessly. We really have. The thing about Furtwängler, the thing that always gets me about Furtwängler is that the cult people, the Furtwängler cult, are worshiping recordings that he never, ever would have approved for release or tolerated because he had standards. He didn't always reach them. Most of the time he did not, in fact. But when he did, he was amazing. And we know what the standards were because we have those exemplars when everything went well and he really achieved what we think he was after. And so if we can't limit ourselves, why are, to the good stuff? What is the point in going after all of this stuff, all supposedly to pay homage to, the great man by worshiping the things that he would have derided as unworthy of him? But that's what cult people do. And that's why the Furtwängler cult is a bad cult. It's a harmful cult. It's a cult of amateurishness. It's a cult of incompetence. It's a cult that ironically does absolutely no justice to the object of worship. Ironic, isn't it? So there you have it, my friends, 10 conductor cults. But now we have to talk about the wannabes, because this is fun. This allows us to see a cult developing, to see how it happens, what it does, and the way that they operate. First, Teodor Currentzis. He's always been somebody just aching for a cult because he's, he regards himself, first of all, as a deity. That's one way to start. But beyond that, with his Mozart operas where he had everybody, living in an internment camp in Siberia where they did nothing but practice every note day in, day out until every vestige of life and humanity had been sucked out of the music, and it was performed like this completely faceless and expressionless mechanism that some people regard as spiritual. I mean, oh boy. So he's absolutely ripe for cult status. Now, of course, as I pointed out, he had a setback because he's supported by Putin's regime and the Russian National Bank and whatnot. And so, but apparently, as one of you pointed out, he's still running around Germany having special worship events, custom tailored events where he can present his quasi-mystico, musico-religious experience to his followers. We'll have to wait and see where that goes if the cult develops. The other one is Christian Thielemann. And you'll notice cult people always have to be organized around prior cult composers like Wagner, or the German standard repertoire, because it's cult repertoire. It's the kind of music that supposedly, theoretically, everyone's been telling us for, since time immemorial, aspires to higher things. And so because it aspires to higher things, and Wagner, of course, was a shamefaced cultivator, because it aspires to that status of quasi-religious significance, it's the people who perform it, by association, acquire that status. Now, Thielemann is probably the worst conductor alive, or one of the worst conductors alive. He can do operas. I credit him that. I mean, I saw him do, Frau and at the Met and all that. He's not a bad opera conductor. He really isn't. With the cast, if the cast is good and if he gets himself together, he can do that. As an orchestral conductor, he's horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. He has no feeling for form, no feeling for shape, no sense of rhythm, no ability to create effective ensemble and balance. Oh, it's just terrible. Absolutely terrible. Notwithstanding which, when I trash his Bruckner, the cultists come out about how wonderful he is and what a genius he is. And he's sticking to that Germanic repertoire because he wants to be not the second coming, but the third or fourth or fifth coming, the Messiah who represents the traditional spiritual German values of higher level conceptual thought, whereas on the ground he's just a slob. And, we'll see what happens. If the cult develops, it will be interesting to find out. So stay with this channel. We'll be following their careers with interest. And keep on listening, friends. Thank you for joining me. Take care.